Okay, today we're going to look at the roots of self-government. And there's really three different areas that we're going to look at. We're going to look at the government, the English government, and their kind of traditions that has been passed down to the colonies. We're going to look at the First Great Awakening, and then we're going to look at the Enlightenment. So let's get started. Okay, and I titled this Creeping Toward Democracy because you can see here we've got the Magna Carta in 1215, but then we've got the English Bill of Rights, and we're talking about that in 1689. And so, that's a 400-year difference. But Magna Carta is a document that that limits the power of the king, and it limits his power to tax. And this is way back, 800 years ago this year, actually, this document was first created, and it was kind of agreed to time and time again by kings over the years. Another big thing that the Magna Carta says is it gives them a right to a fair trial. So it limits the power of the king to tax. It gives people the right to a fair trial, and another way to say that would be a trial by jury. In other words, the king doesn't just get to say you're guilty. And this kind of comes out of this idea that sometimes perhaps the king, being somebody that has like absolute power, wanted to collect taxes and would just come along and tax somebody, and if they didn't want to pay, he could accuse them of treason or something like that, and then say they were guilty, and then confiscate their material, and so their wealth. And so this is a way to kind of stop the king from being able to do those things, and it limits his power. That kind of continues over the next 400 years. We get to the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s, and the king has really started to overstep his power, and so Parliament actually removes the king from power and invites these two other royals from the Netherlands, William and Mary, and says, hey, come to the colony, or not to the colonies, but come rule us as king. But if you're going to do that, you have to accept this English Bill of Rights, which in it includes the right to a trial by jury, and kind of takes that limit to the power of the king to tax that's in Magna Carta to the next step, and saying Parliament now, because Parliament now exists, didn't exist back in 1215, Parliament must approve raising taxes and raising armies. And so these rights and these protected rights are becoming more enshrined in British society or English society. And Parliament, just to be clear, is an elected legislature in England. In other words, they make the laws, they represent the people. Now, early on, it was very few people that are actually getting any kind of representation. And the same idea with the colonial assemblies. Colonial assemblies are simply elected legislature in the colony. So very similar to Parliament. Some key differences, but a lot of similarities as well. And so we look at the First Great Awakening. And so the First Great Awakening is a religious revival movement. It is that happens both in England and then also in the colonies. And in the colonies, it has the impact of, it really starts to challenge the authority of the Congregationalist church. That's the Puritans in New England. It's also kind of doing the same kind of thing with the Church of England in the middle and southern colonies, particularly the southern colonies. And these preachers that are going around preaching, they're converting both white and black, slave and free. This strengthens the small Baptist and Methodist denominations. These are small denominations. They're not established churches, and so they don't have a lot of really followers at this time, but during the First Great Awakening, they really grow and expand. And so this slide here, we're going to continue, looking at, this is also the First Great Awakening still. And so these evangelical revivalists, another way to say that would be these preachers, these were traveling preachers. They were advocates of religious freedom, and it goes back to that idea that these Baptist and Methodist preachers were not part of these established churches, and so you had to get a license to preach and to teach, and so from the state, and the state didn't always do that, and so these preachers are going around trying to preach the gospel, and they're not getting permission to. They're being denied. If they do go ahead and preach without the license, they can be kicked out of the colony and things like that. And that happened regularly. You're going around preaching and teaching, and you've got hundreds or maybe thousands of people coming to listen to you. Very easily, you can be found and then removed and kicked out of the colony for not following the laws. And so this challenges the established churches. These preachers are not only preaching the gospel, but they're also advocating, hey, religious freedom. You should have the liberty of conscience to follow what you believe to be true. And so this really challenges the established churches and kind of helps to spread this idea of the separation of church and state, that the state can't say, hey, this is the church that you should belong to, especially if you want full rights. And so that's part of what the First Great Awakening does. And then we have the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is an intellectual movement, a philosophical movement that actually happens earlier in the colonial period, like the 1600s, earlier 1600s. And it's this belief in the power of reason to reform society and advance knowledge, kind of above and it's different from the idea that divine revelation can reveal truth to people. And so in many ways, it's kind of an anti-religious movement. There were people that were saying, the Bible is not divinely inspired, is not divine. It is not true revelation. It is really the power of reason that helps us to know things to be true. And so now that doesn't mean every Enlightenment thinker would have said things exactly like that, but that's kind of the idea there a little bit, is that divine revelation is not the way to gain knowledge, but reason and logic are much better at getting us to knowledge. Now today people wouldn't necessarily disagree with that. There's a lot of people that would say both are ways to come to an understanding of the truth, and then there's still people that would say no, it's only through reason and logic. There is no divine revelation. And that's why we have people that have different faiths, and that kind of goes back to this other idea that we were just talking about, the ability to follow your conscience and say what you believe, and really actively be able to participate and believe what it is you truly believe, as opposed to what the state says you have to believe. So John Locke's a really important part of the Enlightenment and really influential in the colonies. He says there's a couple of ideas, and they're definitely related ideas. First off is that monarchs do not have the right to rule. They do not have divine right to rule. In other words, it's not because God has ordained that they can rule. That's divine is talking about God. And so it's not that God has ordained they have the right to rule, but that we have basically a social contract. And so if we have a king or a queen, they rule by the consent of the governed. In other words, consent is kind of a fancy word for permission. We've given them permission to govern us. Well, how is it that we've given them permission? Did we sign a permission slip? No, we didn't rebel against them. If the people rebel, then we're revoking that permission. And if the people do not rebel, then they are consenting or giving permission to the king to rule, or whatever form of government you happen to have. So if you have a democracy or a republic or something of that nature, then you are giving them your consent by your vote, or by even your lack of a vote. You're still giving them your consent. And those are really important ideas in our American system of government. So monarchs do not have the divine right to rule, and social contract that we give them permission to rule us. Okay, so here we have colonial traditions, and these are kind of the traditions that were, kind of the earliest examples of self-government taking place. And a lot of these ideas really come from the ideas we've already talked about, whether it's the British or the English traditions of freedom, or the Enlightenment. Many of these are influenced by that. So, for example, the Mayflower Compact. It's really that Mayflower Compact that was, if you'll remember, was the Pilgrims coming over on the Mayflower. Let's agree to work together for the good of each other. That's really an Enlightenment idea. A social contract is the way it's described. Now, how much the Pilgrims were actually aware of John Locke's ideas on the Enlightenment, I'm not real sure, but it is after John Locke has already written about the social contract, so it probably is somewhat been influenced by that. but also just they're really needing it as out of necessity. There's big argument going on about how they're going to govern themselves because they're not really landing where they're supposed to be. And so they say, hey, well, what if we all just kind of agree together to work together? So out of necessity, they come up with this social contract. The Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is a written constitution for Connecticut, as we've talked about in the past, and it recognizes individuals have rights. And this is one of the things that we're seeing is rights, protected rights that people have, and they're beginning to try to enshrine those rights in law and make sure that those rights are retained over the years. Another couple of rights that we haven't really come up in other things like the Magna Carta, English Bill of Rights, that come up in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut is the secret ballot, secret paper ballot. So we hadn't really talked about that, but this idea is expressed in the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut, as well as the idea that all free men can elect leaders. And so this is where we're talking about. Not necessarily, you don't have to be a church member to vote. All men, free men in the territory or in the colony would have the right to vote. And then finally, the Virginia House of Burgesses, which is in Jamestown, starts in 1619. This is the first English legislative body in the colonies, and so this is kind of the same idea as the colonial assemblies. This is the first colonial assembly, which is similar to this idea of Parliament, that they have the right to make laws. They're the ones that would be taxing in the proposing and passing taxes in the colonies because the people are getting to elect them. So those are the colonial traditions of freedom that we see. And so really kind of what we see here is the development of protected rights. And these are like the right to a fair trial, that Parliament must approve taxes, that Parliament can make laws. And one of the ways that we end up protecting these rights is through representative government. People's representatives make laws. If they make bad laws or that we don't like the way they're doing things, we can vote them out of office and select new representatives. And so this is where we get to this idea of self-government. These are kind of some of the processes that we went through.